Hey everyone, George here and welcome back to the channel. So today's topic is going to be CO2 versus non-CO2 tanks, and we're going to talk about that a little bit in depth today. Do you need CO2 to achieve what I have here, or can you get away with a non-CO2 system and get the same results or similar results as having an elaborate CO2 system set up? We're going to talk about that when we come back, so hang in there with me. So the topic of using a CO2 system versus a non-CO2 system is something that we could probably talk about for hours, but I'm going to try to simplify it a little bit for you today. As we know, with a CO2 system, what you're basically doing is you're injecting CO2 into your tank, giving the opportunity for the plants in that tank, once the lights are turned on, to utilize that CO2 for photosynthesis. And basically what that's doing is allowing your plants, along with the light, which is very important, to give your tank an opportunity to have thriving plants. Now the question is, do you really need the CO2 in order to achieve the same goal? The question I have for many of you is, those of you that are using CO2, how much work is it, and how much do you think that you're really getting out of it as far as the amount of work that you're putting into it? So we're going to get a little bit more into this today, and we're going to talk about the different tanks that I have here in my gallery, and we're going to talk about why I don't use CO2 and how I'm still able to come up with these beautiful, lush plants in these tanks that people, quite frankly, marvel at all the time when they talk to me about my systems and how I'm able to do it. So one of the things that we're going to get into next when we come back is non-CO2 and why I believe that you can achieve the same goals without an elaborate CO2 system, and how I do it. Now, achieving a beautiful tank like this without a CO2 system is not as hard as you think it might be, and it's actually something that I think can save you a ton of money. Now, I did start out in this business using CO2, and I found that over the years that I was spending a lot of money on something that I could achieve with just some different types of products that were going to give me basically the same results. And I really didn't know much about them. And as the years went by, I found that the products were getting more and more sophisticated and much more available and readily available, I should say, to the general public. So what I don't want to do as we get into this video is talk down these very elaborate CO2 systems, because they really are great systems if you have the luxury of spending a lot of money on them. Now, it's not a question as to whether or not I have the ability to spend money on these systems. Basically, what it comes down to is I really don't want to invest the money into these systems because I don't think that I need them. Now, there are a couple of products out there that I use, and I don't by any means want you to think that these are the only products that are available on the market that you can achieve the same goal with. I just happen to use these products because I find that they're really good products for doing what we want to do as far as achieving the same goals as having a sophisticated CO2 system on our tanks. Now, the first product I want to talk about is Flourish. Now, both of these products that I'm going to talk about are made by a company called Seachem. And again, they don't pay me anything to promote their products. I'm simply telling you that I use these products because I have found success in doing so. Now, basically what Flourish does, and you want to use Flourish and Excel together because this is where you really maximize the goals that you're trying to get to make your plants in your tanks absolutely lush and beautiful and green and just really sturdy and healthy plants. Now, basically what Flourish does is it replaces trace elements that have been lost, micro elements that have been lost, and also puts back the nutrition and nutrients that your plants need in order to really thrive. So basically what this is a very elaborate and sophisticated fertilizer. And you have to fertilize your plants. If you don't fertilize your plants are not going to look good over time. So one of the most important things that we want to do is talk about how using these two products together, and like I said, they're both Seachem products. One is called Flourish and the other is called Excel. And I'm going to talk about how when we use these two together, how we achieve the really beautiful plants that you see in my tanks all around my gallery here. And we're going to go through some of these tanks and look at them and really compare them to a CO2 tank and what the differences are. Or I want you to tell me if you can see any differences whatsoever as to why I would need a CO2 system when I really don't have any problems with having my plants really thrive. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more. We're going to go through some of these tanks. We're going to talk about how these tanks look as beautiful as they do with just using these two products and using them very consistently and using them, of course, on a schedule to where you are, whenever doing your water changes or whatever, however you want to do it, that you're putting these nutrients and micro elements back into your system that are so needed in order to make your plants thrive. When we come back, we're going to talk about that a little bit more, a little bit further. So Flourish is basically a once a week, twice a week fertilizer that it's just very comprehensive. It's pretty much a supplement for your natural and freshwater aquariums. It contains a lot of rich assortment of important micro elements, trace elements, and basically just other nutrients that are needed to make your plants thrive. Now, as we talked about how plants achieve the nutrients and the things that are necessary to keep them going, you have to have a certain amount of CO2, and we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. But the most basic thing that you're going to need as your tank ages or as your tank becomes a little bit older and some of the nutrients are used out of the soil, the number one thing that you're going to be looking to do is replace those, and that's basically what Flourish does here. Now, this product also puts back some things that we don't even think about, which is calcium, magnesium, iron, and really just other elements that have been shown to be beneficial to aquatic plants. Macro elements, NPK, fertilizers, use Flourish like the nitrogen, Flourish phosphorus, or Flourish potassium along with this, but I don't think that you absolutely have to have that. And the one thing that is nice about those products along with Flourish is that all of them are very safe for invertebrates such as shrimp and so forth, and they really are not going to create any problems for you when it comes to that. So the first thing you want to look at is the size of the tank that you have. The one that we're looking at right now, which is a water box cube 20, so basically it's a 20 gallon. Of course, we know that with all of that's in this tank, there is not a true 20 gallons in here, but you have to sort of look at that and sort of kind of guesstimate as to how much of this product you're going to use and how much they are going to require you to use them. In other words, how often do you use them? My recommendation is that you use them once or twice a week if you really want to achieve what I've achieved here as far as the lushness and the green, vibrant green, healthy look that these plants have. And so a good example would be they basically tell you to use a capful of the Flourish for every 60 gallons, US gallons, or 250 liters of water. And as I said, use it once or twice a week. For smaller doses, basically you want to sort of look at that cap. And what I like to do is take a syringe of some kind that I can draw up some of this, and I know exactly how much I'm injecting into a 20-gallon water box cube, and that is something that I can do consistently so that every time I'm dosing my tanks, they're getting the same amount. We're not over fertilizing and so forth. The product itself is not going to hurt the tank if you use a little bit more than you should. It's just something you want to try to do is be consistent about that, and try to give your tanks that once or twice a week, basically the same amount each time, so that you're giving them back the same dosage consistently. That way you're not making things in your tank go off balance. Now, as far as Excel goes, how you use that is you're basically using Excel to really use it as a source of bioavailable carbon. And basically what that means is instead of using a c02 system, you're using a liquid type carbon. And people, this is where we run into a lot of problems with people disagreeing or suggesting that that is not an efficient way to get your plants to achieve the look that you want them to have, or to keep them healthy. Most people that are really into CO2 injection systems are going to be probably frowning on using something like Flourish and Excel solely as the ability to keep your plants in good shape. And I totally disagree with that. I've been using these products for several years now, and as you can see from the plants, for example in this tank, many of these plants, with the exception of a few that I've added recently, have really become extremely well established and done very well for long periods of time without suffering any consequences. As you can see, they're very healthy. Most of the plants down in this area here, with the exception of some of the taller ones in the back, which I added recently. If you've been following my videos, you probably have seen me add those. Those are something that you are going to see over time as you use these two products in concert with each other. You're going to see that your plants look really lush. Now, the concept is the same. In order to achieve photosynthesis, which is what makes your plants work with light and fertilizers and carbon is something that takes place when we turn the lights on. So the fertilizers being in the water are working all the time, and Excel is doing the same thing. Even though it's a liquid, basically a liquid carbon, it's not exactly that. It's a little more sophisticated than that and a little more harder to really explain. What I derive from all of this is a substantial benefit when using Flourish and Excel together, as I said. Either alone or in conjunction with each other, CO2 injection of the nutrients that are necessary to get that carbon, liquid carbon, into your system are pretty well established, and turning the lights on in your tanking, having the proper amount of lights going is really important, because again, without photosynthesis, it doesn't really matter whether you're using a CO2 system or if you're using basically fertilizers and liquid CO2. You're not going to achieve those goals unless you have the proper amount of lighting that are going to be used for the type of plants that you might have in your tank. Now, there are going to be people out there that wholeheartedly will disagree with me on whether or not you need CO2 in order to have absolutely beautiful tanks. Well, the bottom line is you can't argue with the fact that these tanks are absolutely just flourishing as far as the plants in them go, and we're doing that basically by a non-CO2 injected system, and we're using chemicals to replace that basically. Now, I know that there's going to be controversy over this, and I know that there are going to be people that say, well, in order to achieve this to the maximum, you're going to need a CO2 injected system. And I'm not going to disagree with that, but basically what I'm going to tell you is that you don't need a CO2 system that's an elaborate system in order to achieve a look in your tank that is satisfying enough to make you feel comfortable with not using a CO2 system. Now, if you can afford a CO2 system, I can afford a CO2 system. That doesn't really have anything to do with whether or not that's the reason I do or I don't use them. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that I don't like playing around with CO2 because there's just so much involved with it, and so many different lines that have to be run to different tanks. I like all of my tanks to be in my gallery and independent of each other, and not worrying about having a separate CO2 system for each one of them, or splitting them up, for example, on a system like this. I just don't want to get into that kind of thing. And I think that the tanks that I have are doing absolutely amazing for not having that kind of a system set up. So I don't want to get into talking about people wasting their money on CO2 systems, when in fact I truly believe that if you have the time, you have the money, you have the resources to set up a CO2 system that is really state-of-the-art, and one that is going to give that carbon dioxide that you need to achieve the interaction with the light on your tank, to achieve photosynthesis, because you can pump all the CO2 you want into your tanks, and if you don't have that light coming on about an hour after you turn your CO2 on, and photosynthesis doesn't start, then it really doesn't make any difference whether you're using it or not. You have to use it properly, and you also have to set it up to shut off in a proper manner as well. So what I'm trying to say basically is that you can achieve a really beautiful bunch of tanks that are independent of each other by just using some products like this. And like I said, these are not the only products on the market out there. They just happen to be the ones that I use, and I will put information down below here as to what these products are. Again, they're made by Seachem, but I will put that information down here, and I will also give you some other Seachem products that I believe are going to also help your plants to thrive a little bit more. As I said, the magnesium and the calcium and all of that stuff is important as well, but these two products have a fair amount of that in there, as well as iron. And so I don't believe that you need to have all of those. I think that just these two products basically are going to give you what you need to make your plants thrive. Now, before we end this video, I want to talk one more thing about storing these products, because there are very little pieces of information that the people that you buy these from are going to give you that are going to be important to the overall quality of these over a long period of time. For example, on Flourish here, if you have this open for more than 2 or 3 weeks and you're not refrigerating this, then basically the product itself isn't going to be much good to you, because this does require refrigeration after several weeks here, because for whatever reason that's just something that they recommend, and they are very, very adamant about that. As far as Excel goes, you don't have to do that. Excel is one that you basically can just keep in a drawer with the rest of your chemicals that you would use for your aquarium. When we come back, we're going to do a little summation on what we talked about, and we're going to talk about some other things that I'm going to really give you some ideas about that are important to keeping your plants in your tank really healthy. So we'll get to that when we come back, so hang in there. So whether you're using a sophisticated injection CO2 system, or you're using these chemicals as we talked about here as a supplement to a actual CO2 system, the goal is basically the same, and that is to get your plants the nutrition that they need, the trace elements that they need, in order to achieve the use of these trace elements and nutrients that are in the water and in the soil that are going to actually mimic a CO2 system. Now, as I said, there's going to be a lot of people out there that are going to talk about how Excel and Flourish are really not the answer to CO2, that CO2 is far superior. I'm not going to quarrel with that, because I do believe that both have a place depending on what you want to do. Now, as I said, most of my tanks are independent of each other and not really close by, so it's very hard to set up an elaborate system without having tubes and all kinds of different pieces of equipment running everywhere. And to avoid that, I basically use the system that I'm talking about. And as you can see from my tanks here, they're not suffering at all. And so for anyone to tell you that you cannot achieve the same goal by using a little bit of a unorthodox, non-traditional CO2 system and have it work is just not true. You can do that, and you can do it very successfully. One of the most important things that I want everyone to understand is that the nutrients in your substrate that your plants are planted in is so important as to the health of those plants. In other words, basically, you have to have something in that soil that is going to support the needs of that plant in order for that plant to successfully thrive in the tank. Now, many of these plants are not submersed when they're grown, and they adapt to water basically after you put them into your tank. And most people wouldn't even know that unless they're really into this hobby. Many of these plants are grown outside in greenhouses, and they're chosen for their ability to adapt to a water environment. And that's the reason why you see certain products. You can't just take any plant and submerge it underwater and get it to grow. If we were able to do that, we would just have endless amounts of plants that we could do this with. And like I said, there's only certain types of plants that are going to be able to adapt themselves to a water environment. But to end this video on a positive note, doing water changes is so important because you're putting trace elements back into the water that are so important to the plants. That's very important. Fighting off algae, having good clean water, having very strong plants, the plants being something that competes with any kind of algae growing in your tank or trying to get a foothold into your tank. If you can get your plants to compete with those by having a lot of plants in your tank and having them compete with the nutrients that are required for algae to thrive, if you rob that algae of the opportunity to steal those nutrients and those trace elements that are necessary for that algae to grow, and your plants are getting them instead, then you're going to pretty much stop algae in its tracks. It doesn't mean you're never going to have algae in your tank. We all battle with that. I'm very successful at keeping it at bay because I do a lot of different things, but that's a completely different topic that we'll cover another time. In fact, if I get a chance, I'll put down below here a link to a video that I have done on different types of algae eaters and things that you can do to minimize the amount of algae that's in your tank by having fish in there that are algae eaters and little workers that are just constantly going at the algae, and they're thriving off it, such as shrimp, snails. You know, that's a whole nother topic that we've talked about before, where they don't do very well in fresh water. But it is important that we do understand that what we're trying to achieve here is good, healthy plants. So follow these instructions that I've given you here. Try these two products by Seachem, or go out and find something that's equally as good as Seachem, and try to put something together that's going to help your plants thrive, and you're really going to be glad that you did. And as I say all the time, plant your tanks as heavily as you possibly can, because a tank that is full of plants is a tank that is not only a natural filtration system, but it's also giving off oxygen for your fish in your tank, and you're going to get this crystal clear water that you see here, and that people are constantly asking me, how do you get that absolutely beautiful crystal clear water? Well, there's a lot more to it than what I just talked about, but it is very important that you have a good balance of healthy plants in your tank to achieve, you know, some of the important aspects of having a healthy and very, very vibrant tank. that is thriving, because these are little ecosystems, and they really do need to have their needs met, or the tanks are not going to do well. Anyways, thanks for joining me today. Hit the like, hit the comments down below there as far as leaving some information for me. If you have a question and I haven't answered it today, I will get back to you. And also subscribe. I really appreciate it when you subscribe, and also share it with your friends. Sharing word of mouth is a big deal as far as keeping this YouTube channel going, and I really do appreciate it. So many of you I know share these videos with other people that are in the hobby, and I always appreciate that. Anyways, George here with The Art of Water. Thanks for watching today, and we'll see you on the next one.